Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Federation Hall. I'm David Sequeira, and I'm the director of the Fiona and Sydney Maya Gallery, and I'm also the person who puts together Art Forum for the Victorian College of the Arts. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I invite you to join me in grounding yourself in the deep knowledge that long before this institution was thought of, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation practiced song and dance here, made paintings and sculptures here, shared stories, practiced healing here. And those rituals continue today, and we don't take it lightly that we get to do what we do as artists, as curators on this country. So it's with joy and honour that I acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and those yet to come. And I acknowledge their inspiring resilience and the gift of their profound relationship with time, country, and cosmos. It's also a pleasure for me to welcome members of staff from the TarraWarra Museum of Art. Today's Art Forum is part of a seminar that started this morning, and welcome back to people who came to the first session. Welcome back. The seminar was really about exploring curatorship through a very specific lens, and I'm not going to take away from Léuli's talk, but the seminar is presented in conjunction with the TarraWarra Museum of Art and the TarraWarra Biennial, and Léuli can talk about that a little bit later. So please, a big warm welcome from the University of Melbourne to TarraWarra Museum of Art staff. Thank you. Now, I could introduce our speaker with 3 words, and if I was to give the introduction that I would give, the 3 words would go, Léuli is busy. That would be. But I'm going to give you the slightly longer version, okay? So, Léuli Eshrāghi intervenes in display territories to prioritise global Indigenous and Asian diasporic visuality, sensual and spoken languages, and ceremonial-political practices. Léuli holds a postdoctoral fellowship from Concordia University, a PhD in Curatorial Practice from Monash University, and a graduate certificate in Indigenous Arts Management from the University of Melbourne. In 2023, Léuli has premiered new work commissioned by Aupuni Space, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Sydney in the National, and Plimsoll Gallery, University of Tasmania. In 2022, Léuli presented new work at the Tate Modern, the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, and the Centre d'Exposition, l'Université de Montréal. Léuli has worked closely with a range of artists to realise exhibitions at the University of Queensland Art Museum, MacKenzie Art Gallery, Artspace Gallery, University of New South Wales Galleries, Vancouver Art Gallery, Artspace Institute of Modern Art, and Gertrude Contemporary. They are Curatorial Researcher in Residence at UQ Art Museum, and of course, the curator of the TarraWarra Biennial, Ua Usi Fa'ava Asavili at TarraWarra Museum of Art. Wherever you are, please make Léuli very, very welcome.
And everyone at home and everyone here, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and I'm going to say talofa lava. I mark the space between us with love. And I don't know you, some of you, I know some of you, and it's with great humility that I tread on this country, Bunurong and Wurundjeri country. Last time I spoke on this podium, I worked here 10 years ago, so it's like a homecoming in a way. I'm really excited to be here to share some of my work, and more than a presentation of the TarraWarra Biennial, which opened 3 weeks ago, which I really invite you to come and see. And I'm assuming that a lot of you have been and seen it. So less than an hour's drive from here. I want to justify some of my curatorial decisions and open a space for criticality, verbal and potatoes, tomatoes welcome. Yams and bush tomatoes, preferably. Across my practice, I'm an artist, I'm a curator. I hope to contribute to the uplifting and the enabling of Indigenous sovereignties in this stolen continent and other stolen lands across the planet. I'm very humbled to have learned from many different people, from lots of different teachings from different Indigenous communities around the world. So I've kept the lights on purpose. I don't want to be super formal behind this lectern. I'm kind of in a post-writing, post-lecturing part of my life where I prefer to have conversational exchange with everybody. So I'm going to show you a few recent projects, which I hope will help to situate some of the thinking behind the development of TarraWarra Biennial 2023. What was the Savili and my TarraWarra colleagues are very adept at pronouncing it, and anyone else who's not fluent in the Samoan language, please learn it. Just wanted to start here. If you, I think everyone who is based in the city, I hope you had the chance to visit Willembeek, which was the first First Nations curated exhibition as part of the Yellingwa Fellowship that was occupied by the person of Stacey Piper, Wurundjeri curator and arts worker, mother. I feel, and we've had many discussions with my colleagues at TarraWarra Museum of Art, that the only reason I felt comfortable to come into this space and curate an exhibition that expanded out from various positions, including in the Great Ocean where I'm from, Samoan archipelago, is because an Indigenous curated exhibition has already taken place. Of course, in previous editions of TarraWarra Biennial 2014, Natalie King and John Mundine curated that edition, Whisper in My Mask. And so I'm not the first person from any background, but I am the first Samoan, and perhaps the first Papapine person as well. But really just wanted to say, particularly that I was unable to visit Willembeek. I wanted to show, just to make sure that you go and access the website and see a whole lot of the incredible resources that were created at that time. Even though John Mundine and Natalie King, who's here, curated that edition of the biennial, it still, for me, marks a recentering on Indigenous knowledges that's really pertinent to how I was able to curate an exhibition there. And similar to the Sovereignty exhibition, which Paula Bella and Max Delaney curated in 2016 at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art down the road, kind of reset the framework of engagement. And particularly in that place, unlike ACA, actually, throughout TarraWarra Museum of Art's history, and I did do an audit when I was invited to curate, to submit a proposal. I did my own personal audit to understand how many Indigenous artists, how many people of color had been invited and exhibited there in previous editions across different exhibitions. That same audit I did when Sovereignty was coming together as a curatorial PhD student at Monash University at the time. And very clearly since 1994, Black City culture, there hadn't been any Indigenous artists, more than one or two people exhibiting at ACA until that exhibition in 2016, which is appalling for the second largest city in the country, about to be the largest. But yeah, so those kinds of structural barriers to First Nations participation, agency, presencing, and then leading towards literacy, I hope, in Indigenous art histories, situated histories, communities of struggle, of politics, solidarity. All of those are really important considerations for me that mean that I can go into a space or not. And particularly as a Samoan person, I don't know if many of you would know, Samoans and many other islanders are majoritarily diasporic people. So there are more people living in Australia, Aotearoa, United States, Hawaii, and Canada, UK, Germany, from the Samoan archipelago than on our homelands. And this is a pattern that is echoed in other parts of Oceania, into the French colonies, into the American colonies, and beyond. So I really want to encourage you to spend time on this portal. It's a lot of really amazing resources and kind of a gut-wrenching video of introducing the exhibition by Stacey Piper when another lockdown meant that people couldn't attend the opening. And the what do you call it, the iron wall between Melbourne and the regions. I wasn't living here, so that my compassion and solidarity with you all. How do you go? At the beginning of 2022, I worked on a research project at the University of New South Wales, commissioned by José de Silva, the director, to understand what the structural barriers to racialized people entering into executive roles, but going beyond the curatorial role, what those might be, even though that institution has been halved in terms of staffing thanks to university cuts and the pandemic. And I assembled a secret group of First Nations and Asian diasporic folks to discuss these kinds of dynamics and our different experiences. There were 5 of us, and we met over that year. And rather than writing another institutional critique essay that no one would read, and that I would be bored of writing myself, I made this artwork, which is a silk print of everybody who's opened doors for me. And I want to name them. Well, you can read the names here. The ones that are hidden are Julie Nagam and Gu Chang. So this is the other 2. But really trying to think about creative ways of honoring everyone around us, and really in a lot of the conversations I've had with my peers in the last, and mentors in the last few months, I feel like we are in a, well, I hope that I'm part of a generational shift where there's less competitiveness and more opening up to structural change for everybody. I think also, particularly, we had an earlier question from Andy Butler about being co-opted by institutions in the last session, and I think I'd just like to say I've been mulling over it and thinking that actually it doesn't matter if anything that I've made or many of my peers have made becomes co-opted as long as that change becomes generalized, because these are not especially when I'm going to tell you a little bit about Samoan language proverbs that I use in exhibition making. Those are not mine. Everybody who speaks that language or learns it is part of that ownership. This is part of the kind of core principles of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. So anyway, these are everybody. So anyone who's on here who is in the audience, I will get a sort of flag printed and give it to you soon. So I'm going to ask you for a sign of hands of who's seen the exhibition. Okay. So this exhibition, this is a still from a work titled Grogo, Rehearsal for Rangda. It's a half-hour film by Sydney and Bali-based artist Layla Stevens, whose work I first encountered in an earlier edition of The National at the Art Gallery in South Wales. There is also a really incredible, in addition to the film, there's an incredible installation of prasok or pandan leaves that have been dried and made into an extension and a supersized version of the goddess or deity Rangda's hair, which announces that space within the exhibition. We've been using this and other stills from the work to promote the exhibition, and literally we're looking through different ways of different prisms of view. And I really wanted to start with this because of our position in Australia as a tourist colonizing force on that island, and the kind of super hyper presence of a place that no one actually knows. And I'm going to say no one and mean the majority. Of course, there might be people in this audience who come from Bali or from other islands in Indonesia and know those places really deeply. But the generalized illiteracy in Australia for First Nations territories and histories within Australia, and then beyond that across Asia and the Great Ocean, is quite troubling. As somebody who was born and grew up here, up north in Yui country, which is on the central coast of so-called Queensland. But these are some of the deep questions that have been driving the development of this exhibition. How do we become neighbors? How could I connect with people down here from my position as an online worker in Mbandwa, Alice Springs for much of the pandemic. Working entirely online, and like the other presenters earlier today, pivoting 16 times and losing the love, losing the passion in a way for the encounter, for time with people, because you had to do everything on Zoom. And I got to a point, I had quite a good setup of working on my laptop underneath the stairs in my house. My partner is a doctor going to the hospital. And then I was like, oh, it's been like every week, it's like 3 or 4 days I don't leave the house. I need to like maybe get a coffee every day and like see the world. And if you are really depressed in the kind of seasonal depression that will come as the weather gets darker here, I just want to remind you, because no one ever told me in 10 years of living in Nam, that Mbandwa, Alice Springs is majority sunshine during the winter. Up to 25 during the day, and then like quite cold and good for a fire at night. This is kind of like, this is also how I think. It's very like all over the place. So if you have any questions throughout, I'm really welcome to receive them. But really, I wanted to honor this work. It's one of, it's really, I don't want to say it's my favorite, but it's a standout. And the investment, this is particularly, I think, the only work that significantly changed because borders reopened. And originally, Leila proposed to work in the Australian Museum collections and look at the representations of Chalanarang and other temple performances, and eventually was able to spend time with artisans and temple performers, Leyaks, who are the disciples in the grand narratives of Randa. And in this work, there's a discussion amongst the dancers and their instructors of the gendered nature of certain dances. There's a questioning whether Randa is actually a feminist icon, and some of the belittling and seeing Randa as this like hysterical widow, witch figure, shapeshifter. Is that actually a lot of the kind of gloss of tourist and other super patriarchal influences? The title of the exhibition, Wa'usi Usi Fa'ava Asavili, is a Samoan proverb. I'm going to justify that in a little bit. But particularly there are, it's actually something I've done a few times. I'm realizing in preparing for this talk that it's a way for me to speak my language. I don't know if you've met many Samoans, but I probably spend an hour a year speaking the Samoan language with Angela Tiatia, with my mom, and I did not grow up and live in the western suburbs, and that's great for folks who are there and have access to communities. But I grew up in the country, and then I moved to the inner city. And that's kind of the trajectory of access into the art world through scholarships and things like that. So particularly thinking about language, it was, I'm going to touch on a few points, and particularly this one in terms of language. This was an exhibition created by Heather Igloliorte, who's an Inuit professor, curator, art historian from Nunatsiavut, which is the Inuit region to the north of Labrador. So that's on the east coast of Turtle Island, North America. This is a very significant exhibition in my understanding of Indigenous curatorial practice. Décoloniser Moi, Decolonize Me was staged in 2011, first at the Ottawa Art Gallery. I only ever encountered it through a catalogue, through my first residency at the BAM Center for Arts and Creativity. I don't know if we can move. We can't move, okay, it's fine. It was the first time I came across an exhibition where the artists had the choice to have their artist statements translated into their language, their ancestral language, and particularly that that option was available whether they spoke it or not. And for anyone who's on a language learning journey tied to emotions and culture, it's loaded, super loaded. And I'm a multilingual person, so that's part of my outlook. I speak Samoan, French, English, Spanish, Tokpisin, and Bislama. My siblings are monolingual English speakers. So in 5 years, that kind of difference is very kind of prominent in my family. And it's something that I think about a lot when, there's like 20, 30-year gap between federal policies that encourage language learning and literacy in the regions around us. So this exhibition, there I think was only one artist who didn't want to have their statement translated into their language. I've seen install shots of the exhibition, and I've spoken to Heather Gloriote about curating this exhibition. It toured across different venues in Canada, and still there's yet to be an exhibition like this in Australia. Not saying that there's a linear path, that all exhibitions need to go in any direction, but that honoring of the artist's choice over how their words might reach the language of their ancestors, I think is quite interesting. I did, however, curate the first trilingual exhibition with island languages at Caboolture Regional Art Gallery, Caboolture, in Gubbi Gubbi country, about an hour and a half north of Brisbane. This was in my first year as a PhD candidate at Monash University, and one of the best legs up I've ever received, where Claire Sorn, the director at the time, came to me with a fully funded package to curate an exhibition, to grow as a curator, and to try and make something that was a counter to the Asia Pacific Triennial that was coming up that summer, which I feel like is going to be a through line throughout today's talk. So Waidniu, that's Samoan and Maori, the two largest non-English speaking communities and English speaking communities in that region. Coconut water, particularly thinking about, and this is quite recurring in my practice, thinking about the commodification of so-called superfood, coconut water, coconut milk, but which is an ancestor in Samoan and other communities across the Great Ocean. This is the kind of the front of the catalog that my sibling produced. It was quite, we didn't get the grant from Gordon Darling to make the catalog, so we just go and do it ourselves. This is some of the artists and myself at the opening, and at the top, work on the right by Kirsten Little, who's one of the artists in TarraWarra Biennial, and on the left, work by Stevie Fieldsend, who's I think the only Samoan artist working in glass, or at least in Australia. And the left is, some of the coconut water supplies that you could get at IGA on Brunswick, on Sydney Road in Brunswick at the time. So thinking a lot about hyperpresence of materials that actually the context of them, how do they arrive here, was really front of my mind. And the wall text, the catalog, everything was in Samoan, French, sorry, not French, Samoan, Māori, and English. Ended up I wanted to have English smaller text size, but I had a tussle with the marketing department and some of the council staff, and we ended up having the same size. Around the same time, I was really privileged to work on this project, which went on for 2 other iterations after this. It's titled First Languages of the Monash University Collection, which was essentially a collection writing project to render some of the texts around, new texts around Indigenous and non-English artists or non-English background artists in their languages. So it's quite funny because it ended up being Pedro Wanaimiri translating the text that's written about him in Tiwi language. So, sometimes the same people, it's a very small number of people who are able to work on such a thing. This project went on to be continued by Belinda Briggs, Yoda Yoda curator at Shepparton Art Museum, and by Zoe Rimmer, who's a Pakana curator and strategist based in Nipaluna, Hobart. I'm saying all this particularly in terms of languages because a lot of the considerations throughout the development of TarraWarra Biennial for me were how to be both inside and outside. So how to bring audiences who may not be going to quite a wealthy connoted region with the wineries, but it's also very close to Carnduk, Mission for Warranted community and other Southeastern communities, but particularly, is it effective in 2023 Australia to have wall labels in languages that the majority can't read? And then is it just performative to show such a difference when there's the fight for the Vietnamese language program at Footscray Primary was part of my thinking around who's inside, who's out, how illiterate are we in each other, in each other's histories, and beyond just eating each other's foods. So I encourage you to spend some time on that website. There are also the wall labels that are with those artworks in perpetuity across the Monash University campuses. And part of this first iteration, and due to my relationships with Mandy Nicholson and Carolyn Briggs at the time, now Carolyn Briggs, we were able to have the first, I think it's the first time that an acknowledgement of country statement is translated into the local First Nations languages, which is still at the entrance of Mama in Caulfield. And that was part of this project. So I'm very proud of that moment, hoping for other institutions to follow suit. I think you can see the very bottom of the credit here. But yeah, moving on, thinking a lot about cultural protocols, as I've been showing from being able to work in such a space, thanks to Stacey Piper and working on that exhibition with Beak, but also the longstanding relationship from the outset of TarraWarra Museum of Art's history with First Nations communities across Australia and international artists. If you cast your mind back, this time was also when Santiago Serra's proposal, Hina's proposal was happening with Dark Mofo. It was also a period where I moved from living in Mbanda, Alice Springs to Nicolona, Hobart, and the kind of the economics of people wanting to be super, a lot of people wanting to be critical of such a hospitality for an artist who doesn't really mean anything to show in Australia. It doesn't really mean anything to go to Hobart, but everybody who wants to be critical having to have a job working at Mona or working on Dark Mofo, that was really part of my mind, part of my thinking. So I really want to here think about the rights to kind of different registers of speech. So how can you have a wall label, or how can you support artists to create work that is not necessarily always accessible, or there are multiple registers, not just in their languages, but in the English language, the way that you deploy it, that can be a bit smart, that can be a bit malleable. So a big inspiration, which you can't see all of the credit, is this exhibition by Brooke Andrew, Sanctuary Tombs of the Outcasts, which was presented at the Ian Potter Museum of Art. This is, again, the first year of my PhD, so thinking really expansively about, I don't know if anyone here saw this exhibition. You had to go under, and it's not accessible at all, but you had to go under something like this to go underneath, you know, they broke a lot of museum practice to have audiences go underneath, kind of reach into the subaltern kinds of spaces, the subconscious spaces, and then to access semi-erotic postcards of men and then different ancestors that Brooke Andrew had found across his travels. Thinking a lot about access, thinking a lot about how to have secretive spaces, but how to show through language. So in commissioning and working with artists in TarraWarra Biennial, we were very specific about language. So some of the, particularly in Elias Alavi's work, the title in Persian and Dari is not the same as the English translation, which is right next to it. And so I think every time I do tours out there, I have trouble saying the English title because it's not the Persian title at all. So sometimes it bites you in your face. But yeah, this, I think I haven't really seen any other exhibition that did this. And, you know, for many reasons, it wasn't wheelchair accessible. I wouldn't necessarily encourage that kind of approach, but it was interesting in terms of very specifically making space that couldn't be accessed by everybody. So as an intellectual exercise, it's interesting for me, but obviously in terms of all bodies being able to access a space, not so great. This is, I want to show a few slides speaking about working with proverbs. So the first time that I was able to work with Samoan proverb to title an exhibition was Wanumi Lithau, which is the exhibition I curated as part of Next Wave Festival in 2016, and one of the first people to show Atonga Thames work. And next to some of the photographs from the studio series, on the left, you can see a still from really amazing work by a Colombian artist, Carlos Mota, looking at the demonization of queer sexualities by the conquistadors. And Wanumi Lefau, it also is a rain-related proverb. It means the rain that you've waited for a long time for is well received. And so it is a link to a lot of the cultural practice coming from, in the Samoan context, from the Eastern Islands, which are currently under a United States territory, and that basically things that you wait for a long time for are worthwhile. That was supposedly a curatorial development program I kind of developed myself with Jackie Doty as well, helping me, and Helen Hughes helping me a lot at the time, but there wasn't much support from Next Wave, so apologies if there's anyone in the room. Do better. Yeah. As I was saying, it's, and at the time actually of working on this exhibition, I had recently moved from Fitzroy. So a lot of these references are Melbourne references, and this is a Melbourne audience, but it's really important for me to talk about how I've been able to work internationally after having really focused on the local context and finding ways to speak to histories, particularly at the time. This is one of the last years that Gertrude Contemporary was on Gertrude Street in Fitzroy, a very important street for civil rights, for Aboriginal rights, queer rights, and community organizing, and not much more. Another exhibition that came after this is titled Po Léuli, Thinking and Whaitatusi Mawhaalinga, which Po Léuli is the dark night at the beginning of the universe in Samoan cosmology and in other great ocean cosmologies. Whaitatusi is library or reading room. Whaalinga is display. So I was working with Angela Tietia, with Léuli Eshrāghi, with Lana Lopesi, Joanna Gordon-Smith, and others to think through creating new terms in Samoan language for installation practice, for curating, for display. Because most times you ask people, particularly I would ask my mother, how do you say artist? And she'd be like, oh, artisi. It's like, okay, that's pretty much a calc in English, great. And this is, you can't really see it here, but this exhibition included a reading room, and I know a few people who went there and spent a few hours reading all of the books that I'd collected over many years, which became part of the Black Art Gallery and Black Academy collection after I left Melbourne. And we do have a reading room at the end of the reading space at the end of the exhibition, TarraWarra, but it is like a literal gesture to encourage literacy in art histories from this place and from beyond, but also thinking about you know, the distribution of books. Many of us in this room have contributed to many books, but there's always room for more. And I really wanted to cast your eyes back to this exhibition, which I remembered this morning, has been always sitting in my mind. Some of our early discussions for TarraWarra Biennial, just thinking about how to make audiences come in there barefoot, how to, you know, I'm really interested in one day to curate an exhibition where you get consensually slapped as you enter and experience a work. Thinking about the voyeurism of so many experiences, and particularly thinking about the spectacle, Instagrammability of everything that's happened at NGV for the last 10 years. Not only there, but quite badly there. And this is the space for this kind of discussion. And rather thinking about how visceral the sensorial experience of walking through Gertrude Contemporary's front gallery in this exhibition, Marnula Munungur's Gindi, curated by Helen Hughes, who was a curator there at the time and also working at Monash and now entirely at Monash. I still haven't seen an exhibition like this, and it translates the context from Yirrkala, where the artist works and lives, in a really beautiful way, because it's not reproducing the village, it's not reproducing the homeland outstation, it's translating across, it's still on the wooden floors of a Melbourne gallery, of a contemporary art space. And I'm not saying that we did this in TarraWarra, but these are the kinds of sensorial experiences, immersive experiences that are a lot cheaper than James Turrell, but are in a way so significant because these art histories are only from this place. So I just wanted to kind of focus on this for a moment and think about, I think that's one of the best exhibitions I've ever seen in that organization, but in this city, and hope for encounters that move beyond, even though I'm also, in a way, constrained to making formalist exhibitions through convention, thinking of how you might change that barefoot exhibition making, you know, having to walk through sand, having to get your feet wet. Not everyone's comfortable with those kinds of things. And of course, making different kinds of experiences. Particularly last year, I went to see an exhibition at Kunsthalle Baden-Baden in Southwest Germany. And what I'd always wanted to see in an exhibition about water and bathhouses and Roman ruins was there right in the middle of the gallery. So imagine at the front of these red chairs, seats had been taken out. They had a pit and they had all of this, all of the reticulation that was necessary. 6 dancers flinging water at the audience, at themselves, doing this incredible choreography. And those kinds of experiences, I hope, are where we can engage in spaces and collapse some of these divides between the white cube and the other lived experience, the lived space. I'm going to show you one of the largest projects that I worked on. There's an introductory video with my colleague John Hampton, who's the first Indigenous director of a public art museum in Canada from the Chickasaw Nation. This is, unfortunately for me, one of many projects that I wasn't able to see in person, and I only have these in still shots to share with you, but we are going to see the video work. So the curatorial introduction, because I think it's important for me to show that TarraWarra is an international exhibition composed of artists who are living and working in Australia. And it's not that, I guess in my practice, I've come to a place where it's like easier in a sense to curate internationally and have artists from all around, but it was a beautiful and hard, challenging provocation to work with artists who are based in Australia. Also, thinking back to the lockdowns, I was like, okay, what about this artist who's currently in London? Will they ever be able to come back? But the freight will be insane. Is freight even working? Planes even go anywhere? So that, and also at the outset, wanting to curate a show that was more heavily weighted to Northern Territory, to Western Australia and South Australia, and then realizing that the place that is the most welcoming and supportive of visual arts production dissemination is right here. Is it here? Here. So this exhibition is titled Pasakejinawang, La rivière qui passe entre les rochers, the river that passes through the rocks. It's not the most recent exhibition that brings artists from this part of the world to a Canadian context, particularly after hearing from Kimberly Moulton on Navabe, the Winnipeg Indigenous Triennial. But it was the largest undertaking as a co-curator that I had ever done. Second largest, actually, in Canada, but particularly one that I wasn't able to visit. So we're going to view, and actually the title is taken from this work by Caroline Monet, which is a commission for the 2019 Toronto Biennial. We'll hear a bit more about it in the video.
Chokma, hello. I'm John Hampton, the Executive Director and CEO at the MacKenzie Art Gallery and the co-curator, along with Léuli Eshrāghi of Pasakejinawang, La rivière qui passe entre les rochers, the river that passes through the rocks. Pasakejinawang gathers artists from across Turtle Island in the Great Ocean who examine how languages survive, adapt to, exceed, and resist frameworks of colonial violence and repression. The show considers languages and cultures as living systems akin to rivers and other bodies of water, exploring what happens when their customary flow is interrupted or impeded or diverted through outside forces. The exhibition draws its title from Caroline Monet's monumental sculpture, The Flow Between Hard Places. This concrete sculpture was created through 3D printing the waveforms of Elder Rose Wawate Bodwin saying the Anishinaabe Moan word, Pasakejinawang. It stands at the entrance to the show, signaling the flow of bodies, concepts, and words, while also acting as an obstruction placed directly in the middle of that flow. The waves that our words create in the air that surround us can reverberate across time, memorialized and made solid through art, writing, and memory. This work, Te Tiriti o Watangi, is by Maori artist Nikau Hindin. Nikau's been credited with reawakening the Maori practice of making ote, or paper mulberry bark cloth, through meticulous research and mentorship with expert kapa makers in Hawaii. Since returning to Aotearoa, New Zealand, Hindin has rendered her own signature visual language, which interprets the color palette, iconography, and conceptual focus of Ahua Tutora, customary Maori art frameworks.
So this piece shows the placement of stars on the day that Te Tiriti o Waitangi was signed on February the 6th, 1840. So if you imagine this is the horizon Pairangi, these are the star houses. This is both east and west, and these are the stars rising out of the horizon.
Hindin represents significant constellations present at the moment this new relationship was formed, preceding the land wars that calcified the settler incursions against continuous Maori governance of territory. Lee Tab by Kathy Mattis holds space for Michif speakers, knowledge keepers, and artists. It extends the concept of the Métis kitchen table, which has been explored by Kathy over the course of many years as a site where loved ones are fed, embroidery and beadwork is completed, where language is learned, and where political and cultural scheming occurs. Viewers are invited to api sit for their own conversations and cultural schemes. The words at each seating alludes to the relationships created around kitchen tables in Métis households across the prairies. Joyti Arkand's Kia Taku BU series offers 4 images from the artist's family archives, accompanied by text in Nahiawewen, the Plains Cree language, drawn from words spoken by her mentors throughout their lifelong process of language learning. These potent statements demonstrate conflicting parameters for cultural authenticity, strength, and recovery, coupled with the anxieties and struggles inherent in language learning in the aftermath of Indian residential schools. In the face of these enduring legacies of assimilation and genocide, Arkand offers Kia Taku, BU, a profoundly straightforward sentiment imbued with all the complexity, history, and potential of your being. Dérangement by Carl Trahan charts the movement of a single word as it translates between English and French, moving mechanically through accepted translations from a French-English dictionary and looking at the transformation and movement that happens as we move between the worldviews and languages. The titular word dérangement is a reference to Le Grand Dérangement, the forced expulsion of the Acadians from what is now known as Atlantic Canada. The word and the map shows this movement of trauma and of resilience that happens from this dark point in Canadian history. And beyond looking at federal bilingualism, it looks at an important part of our history and maps a kinship between Acadians and the Cajun culture, which is now well established in Louisiana. Rashad Newsom's shade composition, Screen Tests, is a study and celebration of African American vernacular gestures created by Black women and queer communities. With each new iteration of his live performance, Shade Compositions, Rashad gathers screen tests with local communities, documenting performers as they perform a vocabulary of gestures, adding their own individualistic elements and new insights to the artist's research. These intimate portraits transform stereotypical gestures into a growing archive of new forms of bodily communication, resistance, and community building, born in the underground ballroom scenes and the more mainstream vernaculars that they have influenced. Inyaihi, Telling Rock by Kite and Devin Roneberg interrogates the relationships between human and non-human entities and intelligences. In Oglala Lakota belief structures, materials such as metals, rocks, and minerals can communicate of their own volitions. Attending to the hearing and listening capabilities of non-human entities allows a method of engagement built upon mutual respect and responsibility. As Inyahiihi speaks, you may respond by bending and moving its braids, affecting the sound it makes. Inyahiihi listens to the changes in its own voice and generates a response in lights and sound. In Garuda Mimala, My Connections, by Gutiŋarra Yunupiŋu, he identifies his position relative to the Garudu kinship systems of the moieties, or social groups and clans that structure Yolnu society. Through these signs in Yolnu Sign Language, Yunupiŋu signals the responsibilities to clans and territories in and around his territory, where he lives and works as an editor and camera operator. These signs outline how you are related to help you use appropriate terms of address and clan-specific vocabulary. This form of signing is traditionally learned from an early age by all populations, and it is used to communicate at a distance while hunting and at other times when silence is needed, and it's also a primary form of communication with deaf community members such as the artist. Yunupiŋu is presented here in multiple forms, signaling all his relations and expressing ancestral lineages through a language that lives within his body and the broader spirit of his kinship networks. Outside of the exhibition, Patrick Cruz's Stepmother Tongue greets the viewers as they enter and leave the gallery space. Stepmother Tongue is an evolving series of installations utilizing an invented textual language. The artist blends multiple cultural and symbolic references that contribute to his identity formation. This work is grounded in the pre-colonial script of Baybayin, merged with astrological and other personal references. Suppressed during the Spanish and American colonial regimes throughout the archipelago today called the Philippines, Baybayin is undergoing a revival of use and transmission in the diaspora and in the homeland. The highly gestural installation is a map of personal migration and fragmented belonging, linking ancestral knowledge with other cultural influences and lived experience to create an intensely personal language that is common to the diasporic existence and cultural belongings created today. Together, these works represent a continuing life force of new and ancestral ways of knowing and viewing the world. They map multiple currents that flow past the seemingly monolithic domains of colonial languages to expand our understanding and imagination of histories and futures of culture and languages across territories.
I really wanted to show the entirety of that video to share how, I guess, how I've been communicating about Indigenous work from this continent overseas, but also engaging with other diasporas related to the artists who are part of TarraWarra Biennial, namely Benji Ra, who's from the Philippines, community based in Sydney, but also living, as she says, on the archipelago. And particularly wanting to talk about how this exhibition opened in the first year of the development process for TarraWarra Biennial, in the very beginnings of the curatorial journey, and spending time with way too much time on Zoom with artists because you couldn't actually meet with people in person. That actually follows on the project that I curated just before the pandemic, titled Oleua na Fua Mai Manua, which is yet another proverb related to the rain, meaning that the rain that you waited for from the Eastern Islands is coming with good news. It's worth the wait. This is a still from a work by Anishinaabe artist Caroline Monet, where she reimagines the birth of the Dada movement as composed of Francophone Indigenous women of multiple generations. On the front is Ananisa Bomsawin, the incredible Abenaki filmmaker who's 93 and still making films. And as I show you a few works, you might recognize Gutiŋarra Yunupiŋu's work also in this exhibition. So I really wanted to kind of share some of the justifications for positioning TarraWarra Biennial as really in conversation with exhibitions that I've worked on previously and that I'm working on in the future that relate to and surpass, traverse the Great Ocean and Asia as well. And probably I'm going to share one last, and I guess also similarly to what Kimberly Moulton was sharing earlier, I worked as a curatorial in a curatorial collective. So working alone as a curator with the support of an incredible team at TarraWarra Museum of Art, but on 3 exhibitions that predate the pandemic by a few years. The Commute, where again, we're translating across cultures, across geographies, with different Indigenous artists from Australia, Aotearoa, Canada, the United States, using Canadian funding to support Indigenous artists from the United States, using Australian funding to support artists from Papua New Guinea, a little bit of creative accounting in that way. All of these experiences have really influenced how I work as a curator. The kinds of when you do get the catalog for TarraWarra Biennial, my essay is 7,000 words because little book, because I felt like I had to really honor and situate the histories of each artist, and couldn't really do that in 100 words, 200 words, 500 words. Oh, it keeps going, and you know. That's what we do. But I really want to share a few images from this project, which then, with those 3 exhibitions, and I worked with Tara Hogue, Lana Lopesi, Freya Carmichael, and Sarah Biscaradilli. Freya Carmichael's sister and mother are 2 of these commissioned for this year's TarraWarra Biennial, Sonia Carmichael and Lisi Carmichael. So just kind of also showing beyond what in some of the media we're talking about Nepo influences in the art world, relationships as the basis of curating, and which for me means that I'm responsible to maintaining these kinds of connections, but also being open to critique. So really briefly, that first exhibition in 2018 at the Institute of Modern Art, The Commute, looked at how cultures translate, move across different geographies, and particularly for the Brisbane context, moving beyond, I think because the Queensland Art Gallery curates the Asia Pacific Triennial, there's very little interest in Africa, very little interest in the Americas beyond that, because all of the resources go into that worthwhile enterprise. So for us, thinking about how you might move into other spaces and include artists from other places, this was and similar to what Kimberly was saying, we worked really closely with a number of the artists, but also had times where the different curators were paired with different artists. Second exhibition, Layover, which was at Artspace Aotearoa in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, where we held an anti-symposium, which was mostly eating and storytelling on the floor. And the culmination of these 2 projects, plus a bunch of existing work in the largest exhibition of Indigenous work, local and global, at the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2019 to 2020, just before the pandemic began. Which has a very handsome catalog, which I encourage you to purchase. And there are a large number of forums which you can listen to online, and a lot of these works presented over there again. I feel like I want to close with this work. Also, as a curator, I worked as one of 2 Australian advisors on Reclaim the Earth, which was the largest undertaking of the Palais de Tokyo, the contemporary art space in Paris last year, engaging with Indigenous connections to land and water responsibilities, and also for non-Indigenous artists, their engagements with the theories of ecofeminism. As a Francophone, it was a really enlightening experience to work primarily online, and then because the borders had reopened, to be there in person. And because many of the artists that are not directly in TarraWarra Biennial this year, but in exhibitions just before, just after at the same institution, and then in other projects I've worked on, because most of the artists don't speak French, I ended up being their spokesperson in some of the French media, and that's a very particular role that I take to heart really deeply. But I really want to say how in this context, even the POC invigilators who are working in such a big institution were questioning why Indigenous art was there and not in the Ethnographic Museum down the road. So just to kind of, with some of the thinking around TarraWarra Biennial, really wanting to be proud of our position here, be proud of the curatorial practice, be proud of the artistic production that has been made here. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but unlike Aotearoa, I feel like Australia, when the production from Australia, when it moves internationally, is a bit sheepish, a bit worried about context, and I think that yeah, this was a very frustrating and enlightening experience to see how even the K. Brown Lee Museum, which I was mentioning before, one of the only living Indigenous artists who was commissioned for its opening, Judy Watson, was part of this exhibition. So there was like 15 years between her visits to Paris to see her own work. And many of the other artists, and particularly the French and European in general, engagement with Indigenous art from Australia is usually with senior artists from across the Central and Western Desert, for whom English is their 5th or 6th or 7th language, and who aren't necessarily going to challenge some of the ideas that audiences might be coming there with, in terms of primitivism, fetishization of indigeneity, these kinds of things. All of that to say that I'm going to close with a short introduction video to TarraWarra Biennial and encourage you to, if you haven't already, spend a lot of time out there. It's a destination museum, so that's on our side as well. You can't just go down the road to another place unless it's a winery.
Welcome to TarraWarra Biennial 2023, wa usi usi fa'ava asavili. Enter islands, rivers, mangroves, and seas anew. Come be immersed in the artworks of 15 artists and collectives, contributing to the cultural renaissances of the majority world.
And one last plug for this event on Saturday with Fung and Dr. Michelle Antoinette. That's the next in a number of exciting public programs that we have programmed. I think because the show is up the road, I felt really reticent to show a bunch of in-solo images. So I apologize for those who haven't yet seen the exhibition. It has only opened a few weeks ago, so please spend some time. And Fung will be speaking more directly about this work on Saturday. Thank you.